Well, here we are. Hello and welcome everyone to the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors. Today we have a fascinating look at human performance in pharmaceutical and biopharmaceutical manufacturing, successes and challenges to meaningful industry change, and I'm very much looking forward to this. The session has been produced in large part through the leadership of Julie Avery, so thanks to you, Julie, who chairs this event. And more from Julie in a second. Thanks for all your hard work. I'm Steve Barraclough, your host for today. I'm delighted to be alongside Julie, Brian, and your speakers. Following Brian, you'll hear from Jim Morris on topic 1, from Amy Wilson and John Wilkes on topic 2, and from Cliff Berry concluding on topic 3. So our format today is a little different to what you may be used to. There will be a session for the panel to come in after each topic, that's to say 3 topics. And to close, there will be a session of Q&A between the panel and between you, the audience. And that will take us, I'm hopeful, through to around about an hour and 15, up to a maximum of an hour and 20. So settle back and enjoy that. Now, regulars will know you can use the chat function to say hello, to comment, or to pose questions, and it's great to see many of you finding that. If you do pose a question, can I ask you please to preface it with a Q:, and just helps you, chair and others and speakers, to pick out your questions from comments. That'll be really helpful, and that will help us. So please do that. You may find there may be an answer to your question in chat, or you may find your question is saved up for one of the post-sessions or the Q&A at the end. So just keep your eyes open for your answer. Okay, if you do happen to experience poor sound or vision, then my top tip for you is to close your browser window and return, and that solves many of the local issues that do occur. If there's a general issue that affects the whole platform, then stick with me and I'll inform you as to what's happening and hopefully what we do to fix it. Okay, I'll keep you updated if that's the case. So without further ado, please enjoy our session today, and without further ado, welcome Brian.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you to the Chartered Institute for arranging this webinar, which is produced on behalf of the Pharmaceutical Human Factors Sector Group, which is within the Chartered Institute. This is a unique group of professionals, and it involves patients as well. And its purpose is to consolidate knowledge around pharmaceutical human factors, foster new insight, and support the need for models of human factors integration and competency development across the industry from bench to patient. So it's right through to the system, including all our colleagues and friends in healthcare and anybody with an interest in medical products. But I don't want to hog the limelight because Julie Avery will lead the session today. Julie is previously Human Factors leader. She's retired now from GSK, enormous experience in this area. And I really want to hand over to Julie now to take the lead. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brian. If we could just move on a slide. Thanks very much, Steve. So welcome, everyone. I think this will be a very interesting webinar for everybody. There's a lot of experience and knowledge, not only in the room and the panel, but I'm sure for the audience as well. So we're going to be sharing our experiences about human performance in pharmaceutical and biopharmaceutical manufacturing. This is not about glory stories. This is about successes where we have them, of course, and also challenges for meaningful change. If we can just change slides. Thanks, Steve. Just a reminder for those of you who have just joined, the format today is there'll be 3 topics which the panel will speak on, 10 or 15 minutes for each. The rest of the panel are going to ask some questions and build on those topics. And then at the end, any Q&A that you put in the chat, or if you'd like to come off mute when we get there, we'll take Q&A at the very end, please. So thanks very much. So just to introduce the group, if we could just move on. Thanks, Steve. The Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors, and we're part of the, as Brian said, part of the pharmaceutical sector group. We're the pharmaceutical manufacturing group, and we're the real reason, the purpose for our group is all about patient safety and patient benefit. And I think you'll have some interesting stories about how we focus in this way in our work. Thank you. Next slide. One of the things we all hear about today is we're trying hard to create a future. And so, as this saying says, the best way to predict it is to create it. So we're very collaborative. We learn from other sectors as well as experts within our own to understand human factors, human performance, and the way forward. Next slide. Thanks, Tim. Just to say, the purpose of our subsector group is to integrate human factors into what we're doing. Top of the list is to make it easier for people to do their work. And that way we can optimize human performance within our sector and systems, always to support patient outcomes. Thanks, Stephen. So the first topic that I'm going to hand over to Jim Morris from NSF, we'd like to talk about human-centered approach to work, about realizing the value of operational learning, how simplicity can improve performance, and hopefully ensure work is enjoyable for participants. So I'll hand over to Jim now. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Julie. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm with NSF International, and I'll provide some perspective, and hopefully you find it to be of value, and I'm sure my colleagues would do the same. The context, from my point of view, is really that one of supporting the pharma sector, medical device sector, in the conduct of investigations and improving investigations systems inside companies. That's a lot of the work that we do, among a number of different things. And what's true about this kind of work is that, as introduced by Julie just a moment ago, so much of our focus in conducting investigations is thinking about the end product and the user, in this case, mostly the patients that will be taking the products, but also thinking about the regulators and thinking about the business aspects as well. And what we find to also be true about investigations related work in the quality and manufacturing space, that's specifically the area that I typically focus in, is that many of the investigations that we carry out have a human component to them. The vast majority do. And many of our clients will report out that, say, over 50% of the investigations are actually categorized, if you will, as human error related investigations. And so what we work to do with our clients and in our work is to try to tease away, to focus away from the human and to think about the context, think about the underlying systems, think about work design, and think essentially about contributing factors. And it's not easy to do. It's something that's quite difficult to do in many respects, and it takes quite a bit of work, quite a bit of discipline. And that's essentially a core message to put forward on this webinar. So that's the context. The second point that's worth putting into focus here is the value of operational learning. And the operational learning and definition is, and I'll cheat just for a moment, it's the capacity of an organization to understand how people and systems perform in the context of the organization. It's essentially learning from the perspective of those that are doing the work, and that's a key message. I've intuitively found that there's a lot of value in operational learning, and I think in this webinar you're going to hear about some of the techniques that we use to implement and to essentially learn from in the context of our organizations. The third point that's worth putting forward is the importance, and this is essentially a pet peeve in many respects, is the importance of simplicity. It's in simplicity it's in simple design that we can achieve higher levels of performance. And I think most of us can appreciate that from the context of designing things such that people can execute their work without having to think about the complexity underlying the components, say. We can come up with examples of where that may be the case. We can think about the implementation of lean principles in organizations and how that essentially reduces cognitive load and helps people carry out their work with less chance of deviation, if you will. But there's another point around simplicity that's important to think about, not just about simplicity in design, but also simplicity in the solutions that we put forward. And what I mean by that is that, and this is an important point for pharma, med device, and probably for many sectors, is that when we think of solutions that we put forward to our problems, often we overcomplicate things, and we come up with solutions that perhaps are adding additional checks, are implementing new forms, essentially at the end of the day, not necessarily making things more simple, but rather, on the contrary, making them more complex. So I'd like to underline that is the importance of coming up with simple solutions, not just in design of work, but also in the solutions to some of our investigations. And then lastly, it's important to put all this in context and recognize that at the end of the day, what we're looking to do is to assure that work is enjoyable. And that we can do through some of the techniques that we'll put forward in this webinar related to operational learning. It's really tapping the expertise of those closest to where work is performed and recognizing the value of their contribution, which brings enjoyment. It's really through the bonds between people that we find, at least I find, that there's value in the work that we do. So I'd just like to close by underlining that point, the importance of that point, not forgetting that at the end of the day. So I'll stop there. Those are essentially some opening comments. I hope there's some value to you all.
Thank you, Jim.
Yeah,
thanks.
you're welcome.
As a follow-up question, in your role as a consultant, you've had the opportunity to see how different organizations place high value on operational learning. So my question is, how are those organizations that do place that high value on operational learning, how are they showing that?
Well, I think that what we would see in many of these organizations that are essentially leading in this space is that they're making room for training. They're assuring that, John, the organization and there's essentially broad acceptance of many of the principles related to human and organizational performance. So there's broad-based training is the first point. They've also made space for assuring that some of the principles and some of the techniques that, such as pre and post-action reviews, learning teams, some of these techniques that help foster operational learning, they're given time. There's room for them in the organization. They're planned. They're not just ad hoc. And ultimately, I think to assure that it's also stated that our management is supportive, that there's a long view in place, that this is not a flavor of the month type approach. And you have buy-in by senior leadership at organizations that really embrace operational learning and look to embed these, not because they're going to get a return tomorrow, but they're looking to see a return over a longer period of time. So I hope that helps everyone, answers your question, John. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
I have a question, either for Jim or anybody else. If you look at biopharma manufacturing today, you don't find human and organizational performance in many locations. You'll see it in a few. And I guess the question is, what does it take to take a manufacturing head or a site head and open their eyes to wow, that event was a fundamental surprise, and I may not have all the answers. What's this thing called HOP?
Well, I can pick up on that, Cliff. The leader that embraces these concepts is really looking longer term and recognizing the value that comes from the contribution of those that are performing the work. They see the value in essentially a transparent work environment, an open work environment, and recognize that they don't have all the answers. And then many of the answers to the solutions that we seek to improve our operations lie with those that are at the sharp end, that are performing operations on a day-to-day basis. That's not easy. And there's the other side of the coin of those leaders that have really focused on leaning out organizations to the point where people don't have the time to think, the time to react. And I've seen that in many places. And it's difficult for those kinds of organizations to improve. They're going to be in a reactive mode. So I think the leader that recognizes the proactivity that sits with operational learning also recognizes that there's a long-term value in putting forward time for those kinds of initiatives. Welcome. Any other comments on that one? It's a great question, Cliff. Thanks.
If I could answer a question with a question, I think a good question to ask that leader might be, how has what we've always done changed where we are today, right? Because I think one of the things that really makes this topic really resonate is the fact that many of us have come to the conclusion that doing the same things over and over and expecting a different result hasn't yielded that. Deviation numbers have remained relatively static. Human performance events are still attributed 50% of the time or better. So what are some alternatives that we can consider, and then trying them out? And I think some of the most powerful lessons are really in those opportunities where we can take those leaders, to the source of those problems, or to where those events have occurred, and have those discussions about, the organizational factors and the local factors and the role that those played in a given event.
Jim, just in the closing minutes, I would like to ask about the enjoying your work piece. I've a lot of experience working in lean, and when we put in standard work and we try and control the variation for good reasons, because we don't want to have issues, sometimes it feels a bit like a straitjacket. And I just wondered what your experience is with clients when you're trying to balance the good intention of lean and the difference that is human performance, which isn't always understood.
Yeah, I think that, and if some of you have read some of the work that this collaboration has put forward, there's space for both, of course, and we need to find that balance. So your question is excellent, Julie. There is that end of the spectrum where perhaps we've leaned, if that's a verb, leaned out too far. And I've seen that in some operations where people are really stretched. And yes, we've maximized efficiency. We've maximized, if you will, performance. But we've gotten to a point in some places where people don't have, and I mentioned it earlier, don't have time to think. And that's not good. I think what we need is to standardize work to a degree to assure reproducibility, minimize variability, at least in my view, assure that there's space for those people that are performing the work to contribute, because it's a continuous exercise. We're never finished. And if they don't have time to essentially provide their point of view, we're not benefiting from that experience. So within the context of lean, which is really important in operations to reduce variability, we also need to think about making room for those people that are in that space at all levels to contribute. And that's the balance that we have to seek in our management.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So I think if it's okay with people, we'll move on to the next topic, which is Amy, being led by Amy and John. If you could just move the slide, Steve, that would be great. Thank you very much. So we're thinking about sort of building on what we were saying about lean, integrating human performance into existing systems, and the experience that Amy and John have. The points we're looking there about recognizing the overall change, context is everything, and how we can watch out for and seize opportunities. So I'll hand over to Amy now. Thanks, Amy.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. And I think I'll be speaking primarily to this first point around, many of you on this call maybe are already starting a human performance journey. Maybe you're thinking about it, you might be in the middle of it, or maybe you joined this call to learn more about what it is. Regardless of where you are in that process, I think it is important to recognize that this thing that we call human performance, depending on your current organizational situation, is likely to be a significant change. It's not, just you could say, technical change in doing some practices that maybe you weren't doing before. To do this really well, it requires, in many cases, a different way of thinking. And I know that was a lot of what was spoken to in the first topic, how you approach investigations, how you learn from when things go wrong. Those are fundamentally anchored for people in, maybe what their past experience has been. So I think from a human performance integration perspective, you start from the principles. Todd Conklin has listed 5 principles of human performance. I think they form a really good basis for then what you might do in your organization. The 5 principles being: 1, that error is normal. Even the best people make mistakes. The 2nd being that blame fixes nothing. The 3rd being that learning is vital. The 4th being that context drives behavior. And the last being that how you respond to failure matters. And I know for myself within my organization, when we made this decision, what is really a commitment to integrate human performance into our operations, we needed to take that step back to say, if these are the things that we want to take on as part of our belief system, or the things that we believe to be true, principles that we'll adhere to, what does that mean for things that we need to change? There are things that we needed to start doing differently. There were things that were already in place that we could build on. I think some examples on both sides, and we've already talked about, approaches to learning, approaches to investigation, how you handle human error when it happens, if you will. That generally is something you're likely going to need to change. Whereas if you have, let's say, mature programs around leaders watching work being performed, that's probably something that you can build on and build from to build that within the organization. Just to speak a little bit to biopharma manufacturing and some challenges around human performance integration, we have a very long history of kind of compliance to rule and a strong orientation to wanting to avoid audit observations and deviations. Compliance to rule is not a bad thing. I'm not suggesting that at all. We've already talked about you need to have standards for performance and you need to understand where you are against those standards. However, there's a difference between being compliant with a rule and being able to actually perform a work activity successfully, and kind of starting to build an understanding of that difference becomes important. Also, the regulatory environment sometimes gets in the way of good operational learning. Historically, we tend to leverage investigations as a primary learning point. And through human performance, what we try to do is introduce a lot more proactive practices. Let's get ahead of those deviations by having, the after action review discussions, the post job review discussions, by doing the work observations and things like that. And that's where sometimes that can be uncomfortable to people. They don't know where to write down those learnings because, they don't want, let's say, dirty laundry to become available to auditors. And that's something that you can navigate, but again, is a part of our environment that does increase the challenge with this. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to John so he can share his experience and also expand on the importance of context.
Thank you, Amy. I couldn't agree more with those points that you've raised. And I would say that our experience at AstraZeneca certainly demonstrated all of the points that you've made. When I think about what we're doing, at an enterprise level, we've started to introduce the principles and practices of human performance by starting with event learning. And when we think of event learning, we might call it reactive operational learning. So to your first point, really regarding the impact on current beliefs and ways of thinking, what we've started to do is introduce people to the concept of mental models of performance and failure. And for some people, this is a totally new idea. But for everyone, it's created an opportunity to recognize what their default mental model is and to see how that mental model impacts the way we manage and the way we learn and the way we improve. And so this has been a real inflection point because as people are starting to recognize their mental model and then contrast that with other models that might be more compatible with these principles of human performance, they can recognize the change in perspective that's needed for them to embrace these ideas. So, certainly that very first point regarding, recognizing the potential impact and the change that will have to be made on perhaps beliefs and ways of thinking is really key. And that, naturally, as you were indicating, really leads us to this idea around context, and particularly organizational context. And it being so critical to integration is really quite appropriate because it really validates at an organizational level the principle of human performance regarding the impact of context on decisions and actions. So a big part of the organizational context at AstraZeneca is the influence of lean on our operating model. And we've mentioned lean a few times already today. What we recognized is that any successful attempt at integrating human performance at AZ was going to have to consider the influence that lean would have. And so, to give you a specific example, problem solving plays a crucial role in lean. And so as an opportunity and a challenge, we started with event learning, and working with our colleagues in the lean community has really given us at AZ, given our human performance effort, some support and some credibility. And so, ultimately it was the context of our organization and what, how we work in our current operating models that really drove us to a partnership with lean, as well as the starting point of focusing on event learning. And for other organizations, perhaps you have your quality organization is the one that drives your operating model. And so perhaps you would need to consider how the influence that the quality organization will have on your human and organizational performance integration efforts. And then, finally, I think the last point that we have regarding, watching for and seizing opportunities. At AZ, we've implemented and integrated human performance in some pretty diverse areas. We've gone everywhere from the manufacturing floor and QC labs to one of our animal sciences and technology teams. And the important thing is that all of those areas showed interest. They were pulling for HOP and or human performance. And these pull opportunities were really critical because they gave us an opportunity to learn and to kind of sharpen what our integration approach needed to be. So I think the cautions that I would give here is that you have to be really careful and balance between the desire to push and drive human performance into the organization versus where the organization is and its willingness and readiness to go there. And I think that speaks in large part to that context. And really, this is probably why supporting those groups who are interested, who are pulling, is probably your most valuable pathway early on. It certainly was for us, because I think one of the things that we recognized is that until there's broader enterprise support, these pull opportunities may be all we have to prove the value of human performance principles and practices in the organization. So with that, I think if there's an opportunity to take a couple of questions, we can certainly do that.
Thank you, John.
I have a question for John or Amy, and Amy. Talking about importance of context is everything, and these investigations, and really the purpose of an investigation is to learn. And there's this, anxiety around making sure what we document is what we learn is going to cast a positive light on our organizations when it's reviewed by the FDA or another inspection agency. How do you, or what have you done in the past to improve how we learn during investigations and also how the information is shared within the organization so others have the benefit of what has been learned?
Yeah, it's a really good question because, as you said, a primary customer, if you will, of our investigation reports are the auditors. So the learning obviously benefits the organization. We can identify actions to take to drive improvement, but ultimately what an auditor is going to be concerned with is, are your systems in a state of control? And when I read these reports, am I assured that you are keeping your systems in a state of control? So there is very much a balance there that needs to be maintained. And there are situations where some of the learnings that you have in the course of an investigation do get shared within the organization differently. If maybe they're more related to business practices and they're not so much a part of a direct quality system that would be audited, then we start doing other things to share that learning. There's kind of one-page learnings that can be created and sent out. Otherwise you do it through, different meetings and other forums like that. Something else that we've started doing recently, which has been a helpful actual quality system integration, is with our risk management system. So when we identify things that might be issues, we're able to kind of demonstrate that, yes, we understand this as a risk and we're going to capture it there. So that way we're carrying that mitigation past the investigation itself. That's been our experience.
I really don't have much to add to that answer. I think that's pretty solid. I think one of the things that we're really attempting to get the organization to think about are really what are the artifacts of learning that we create, and how do we sustain and potentially institutionalize that learning. And there's a number of ways that you can do that, certainly through communication and the sharing, but also the permanence of the improvements that you make, as well as the changes to the learning and education content that the organization has, is an opportunity to get those learnings to stick and have some permanence. So, your own internal events are great material to add to your learning and education systems.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to this because it's a great question. We should not be afraid of a regulator or auditor's commentary when we have mature systems. If we have confidence in our investigative systems, we should be in a good position to defend our rationale for the actions we've taken, the decisions we've taken. So that's point number one. The other point that's important to consider is that not all investigations are equal, and is I think most of us would relate, and Cliff, certainly from your experience outside of pharma, from the energy sector, there's a risk-based approach to conducting investigations, such that some investigations may not even enter, if you will, the quality system. As Amy indicated, they may belong outside of the system, but yet there's true business learning that can be provided to the organization. And we have to be in a position and be mature enough as leaders to be able to distinguish between those different types of events and treat them appropriately. Where there's greater risk and potentially risk to patient safety, of course, they get treated with a higher degree of caution and therefore fully investigated. But where that risk doesn't exist, let's move them through the system quickly. Let's not let them bog down the system. And if they don't belong in the quote unquote quality system, let's keep them out. But yet share the learnings where appropriate. Mm-hmm. So just a few points on that one. It's a great question.
In your experience, have the regulators, do they understand the language of HOP? Anyone?
Yeah, I've actually experienced, I would say, both ways, where we have had inspectors that did not really understand. And when we were trying to explain some of the investigative approaches, it was difficult. And, the transition from the person made a mistake, why are you not retraining them, to, our approach of a person made a mistake, let's understand how that happened and what controls we can put in place around that to help other people be successful, was kind of a difficult conversation. At the same time, I think there are at least segments within a lot of the regulatory agencies that oversee our work that, like at conferences and things, you will see some of them start to point out, there is a dissatisfaction by our regulators of having 50% or whatever it is, operator error investigations. They understand that that's not where we want to be either. And I think a part of what we need to continue to work toward is helping them understand what the pathway to change that is. Our pathway, or what we suggest, obviously, is human and organizational performance and integrating these principles. But I think the regulators holistically are not there yet.
Yeah, I'm with you. It seems to be a little bit individual sometimes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree.
Can I add one thing to that? I think the thing that's really struck me that I've been thinking a lot about lately is really the historical climate, and there's there's context and a basis for that makes it make sense. So let's make sure that that's out there. But the historical basis of the mental model, the dominant mental model in our industry of people as a problem to control, mm-hmm. right? And so when your industry mental model is that, then your responses are going to be encouragement, education, engagement, and enforcement, right? And that's not wrong as much as it is just a current state. And so I think one of the things that we have to do as we start representing these approaches to regulators is really helping them bridge, build that bridge between the current mental state, mental model, and mental models that are more supportive of practices and principles of human and organizational performance. And particularly that means really focusing on systems-based approaches towards improvement rather than targeted individual, interventions.
Yeah. Thank you, John.
Yeah, I would, if I just one additional comment on this, I would prefer to see an auditor come into a site and recognize that we may have one-off events, and that's okay because we have techniques in place to monitor. Where we have reoccurrence, on the other hand, that auditor is looking at the organization and assuring that the organization is asking those more difficult questions about the underlying reasons for why something took place, and is looking at the context, that the organization is looking at the context. That's what I would hope that the auditor, be it a regulatory auditor or an auditor, a third-party auditor, that's coming in and asking those more challenging questions when there's reoccurrence around an event.
Brilliant. I'm going to ask if we can move on now to the third topic that Cliff's going to cover. So this is around getting out of our own way. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you, Cliff.
You're welcome. So those are the three major themes I'll hit upon. The first one is just the way we think as an industry or an organization really is an obstacle to adopting many of these principles and practices for human organizational performance. Amy mentioned earlier about the importance of compliance in the job of manufacturing, and it truly is important. And every day things go, for the most part, really well, and we don't fail. And so if we're complying, we think, and if things worked well yesterday and last month, then today when we failed, how could that have been? It must be somebody who wasn't complying. So there is this fixation on the event being unusual and a surprise, the failure being unusual, very unusual and a surprise, and focusing on the individual. And how that kind of plays out too is even looking at what we look at when we gauge improvement or lack thereof. We're looking at counts of deviations or no deviations on that day. So no deviations are good and deviations are bad. And we look at human error. Our processes for when we get a deviation and we do our investigation, there's cause codes that are typically attached to the investigation to explain kind of how, but the how is very thin. We have a cause code available typically in most places called human error or operator error. And people kind of treat that cause code as a cause. And so there you go. Half of our deviations are from human error, where really we built this process to force people to end there. And it is really difficult to kind of undo that. Let's get rid of human error as a cause, because it's not. It just feels weird. And then what gets in the way of that even is, well, what about accountability? If human error is not a cause, then how do we hold people accountable for when those days when they maybe aren't, I don't know, paying as much attention or trying as hard as they did the other day? And these are really the conversations that take place, and they're absurd. So that's kind of part of the internal challenge, is thinking differently, being supportive of, compliance is important, but it's a system and there's a degree of reliability, and it will fail at some point. And if it's failing more often than we're okay with, then let's fix the system. That's a hard place to kind of move the organization to. Another challenge is missing expertise. I mean, you look around in my organization or places I've been before, or in your organizations, and who's doing human performance? Who's like the expert? Who's the practical expertise? Where's the human factor engineers? Where are the industrial engineers? Where's the organizational psychologists? You won't find a whole bunch of them. And what ends up happening is we build these new, these manufacturing locations, a suite, a skid, and we don't have somebody who's knowledgeable of how to design things so they're reliable and they're helpful and they help the operator. And what happens is we build it like we built it the last time, and we have the same problems that just show up again and again and again. How does someone know how to write a good SOP, one that's actually helpful and it's usable? How does somebody know how to write good automation? So it's actually a partner, a teammate, a good teammate to the operator. You won't find this expertise right now in manufacturing. These human factor engineers, industrial engineers, organizational psychologists. Most often it's somebody maybe from a quality organization or a manufacturing org, and they'll go online and they'll look for ideas like, how do I do human performance? And they'll typically all end up in the place where a lot of people end up, and that's kind of like maybe Department of Energy handbook on human performance, which was really good at the time, but in the time it was 1995 to 2005. Things have changed. And in addition, the industry is not the industry where that came from. So a lot of the ideas and the solutions to the problems are going to need to be developed internal to this industry. They can't come from outside. That's one, is that industry piece, or I should say the expertise piece. And then another one is, we have a lot of turnover as an industry. It's typically 10% to 15%. It gets higher at times. And so you lose this expertise. You lose a sponsor. It's so important to have a strong sponsor at your side if you're going to do human and organizational performance. But people come and they go, and now you're put in a place where you have to re-educate a large part of the organization and key people who you need. There isn't any guidance right now, say from the FDA, like they have for devices. There's a really nice handbook or a guideline for a medical device, and how do you apply human factors to the design? How do you test it? I don't know any such handbook or guidance from the FDA or anywhere else about how do I build a manufacturing plant or a skid or suite where I'm thinking about everything I got to do to human factor in a way where it's reliable and helpful to people. How do I know how to write an SOP? How do I know how to write an MBR? Even the idea of identifying in a batch record or a procedure where the risk is. And when I say risk, beyond just risk to the human being, for being injured, but risk to the product. It's a very foreign idea to most companies right now to identify those points of no return in a unit operation. So these operators who may not be very experienced are aware, this is the step where I need to slow down and get some help. So yeah, if there was some information, some guidance from the FDA, that'd be wonderful. Open up to any questions you want to ask.
Yeah, so Cliff, one from my perspective, when you talk about vocabulary and a part of it is just needing to integrate kind of the human organizational performance vocabulary, building a different understanding around how we use some words already. And that's where my question is, what are some words or phrases that you hear that just kind of demonstrate maybe where you need to focus on helping change those mental models?
It's a good question. I mean, the easy one, the one that comes to mind, everybody here and everybody on the call, is probably, hey, we lost a batch last night. It was operator error. That one there is like, aha, we've already figured out the cause, or maybe the lack of understanding of how it happened. Another one is the smoking gun, the silver bullet. These are all examples of a mental model, perhaps, of it's not the system, it's that one faulty component. If I just find that one faulty component, I can fix it and everything will be good again. Those are ideas. Those are words that kind of flag, I guess, as to you probably aren't where you need to be. And open up to anybody else in this panel to have some words you might want to share too.
Well, let's just retrain.
There you go. There's another one. Let's retrain.
Yeah, I'm sure this one's a good one as well. Yeah, we need to hold people accountable.
That's a good one too.
Right. Let's talk about accountability. Okay.
How about this? Instead of holding people accountable, can the people that are executing the work account for their actions?
Yeah.
Can we turn that around a little bit?
And I think that is the alternative. I know interesting discussions that you do get into around accountability is, I don't know, kind of the notions around, from a human and organizational performance perspective, we're always going to look at like the system and how well everything in an integrated way is performing together. We're not suggesting that performance management of individuals in your organization shouldn't be done, but that's the appropriate place for, when you use the phrase, hold them accountable. And what you really mean is I need to somehow put a consequence on this individual for the action they took or didn't take. That is a individual performance management conversation. Anyway, so it's just kind of trying to help the organization navigate that. I will say where it becomes a challenge is in those high impact events. Oh, but this time we lost an entire batch of product. I have to hold this person accountable. That's a difficult thing sometimes to help leaders understand. It just simply isn't going to help. And that goes back to that principle around blame fixes nothing. You might feel like you did something by, writing in that person's performance that they made this mistake, but you didn't help the organization do better next time.
Yeah, I try to pick up on that, Amy. Let's say somebody leaves a wrench in a centrifuge during a changeover, and it goes into the next batch. Batch is lost. We're talking about significant financial hit.
Yep.
We're going to hold somebody accountable? No. There's a reason why the wrench was left in the centrifuge, and that's the question that we need to ask, is to really try to tease it out. And so often we're going to jump to, well, who are we going to blame? And it can't work that way. It can't continue that way.
When a leader asked me, sorry.
Go ahead, Julie.
When a leader asked me, a woman leader asked me, well, I can't hold this person accountable for this mistake that they made. I asked them how many times they thought that year that they had done that task. And we worked it out. It's about 980 or so. I think it was 982, to be honest, because it's in my mind. And I asked her, so we held them accountable 981 times. And like, what do you think the biggest challenge is? What's your feeling about that for them? And unfortunately, she didn't have the answer. So that kind of led us into a different conversation about holding them accountable on this one time that it went wrong. That was quite a useful way in. A bit cheeky, but she let me do it. Sorry, John.
The comment that I wanted to make was was related to missing expertise in the organization. I think that's a really insightful point. What I would particularly, it might be difficult for smaller organizations, but look at places where it's common. Your human factors experts probably exist in your safety organization, but because they're in the safety organization, we don't necessarily think about calling on them to help us with, operations that might be having some adverse quality events. They're human factors experts, whether they're talking about safety or other critical business requirements. So, look broadly in your organization, because there tends to be expertise that's very functional, but hasn't been made broadly available.
I'd like to pick up on a question that somebody had asked in the chat, and perhaps one of us can speak to it, which is in the context of turnover in the industry, and turnover at all levels. Cliff just mentioned it may approach 15%. That's an extremely high number. How do we assure continuity? Because this is a long view for industry. Implementing the HOP principles really requires a vision by senior leaders. How do you at Biogen, for instance, Takeda, AstraZeneca, how are you seeing this sort of continuity continuing as they're in the midst of maybe senior leadership change or changeover at different levels?
Right. The first thing that comes to my mind is, I think, as we've integrated human performance here, kind of that word integration and having an eye towards how things would be sustained was a critical part of our strategy from the beginning. How can we do these things we want to do in a way that they truly become a part of the way that we work, so that they're less susceptible to leader changes. So that's one important aspect. And the other that I'll mention is, I think we've in some ways maybe benefited from having a consistent person for human performance. So you can sort of, adjust to those changes and support those changes. But you do kind of have to start over with, kind of retraining. Every time we have new senior leadership come in, that first meeting, you get a good understanding of, and John's used this word a lot, where is their mental model? Where are they with being able to support you or not? Thankfully, I feel like I've been fortunate through changes here. We've had supportive leaders, but that can very much change, and that will have a big impact on some of the things that we've done.
Yeah, those are great comments. At AstraZeneca, I think I mentioned the impact that Lean has as our operating model. So any permanence of of human performance was going to come through our ability to integrate through Lean. And so we've really focused on developing partnerships through our Lean community in order to get some permanence. The other thing, though, I would highlight is I think you have to have some conversations in the organization about how these principles and ideas enable your company's values, right? I mean, if the values of your organization don't align with the principles of human and organizational performance, then you're probably looking at a bridge too far. But most of our organizations have values that are very much aligned with these principles. And so how can you shape a narrative where you create alignment between your organization's values and the principles of human and organizational performance? I think adds to your ability to give it some longevity beyond the individuals who are there.
I'll add on to that answer. I will say, too, I'm going to leave this meeting in about a minute or two from now. I apologize. My calendar didn't quite line up exactly with the meeting. I find it helpful to kind of embed within our processes and our procedures these practices and principles for human and organizational performance. So how we investigate, the methods we use, event and causal factor charting as opposed to a 5Y. After action review, actually having, an application out there, a place where you can easily record it after action review and share with everybody. By building these tools, these processes, even when the sponsor leaves or your manager leaves in an area, they kind of have a life of their own and they continue on as long as they're providing some type of good, positive benefit to the organization. If it's just about we train people and we talk about this, as soon as that sponsor leaves, it's going to evaporate. So.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Cliff. So I think we've come to the end of our topic discussions, and now, if it's okay with everybody, we can go to some of the questions. Brian, I know you've been looking at some of them, and I have as well.
Yeah, I'll just say a few words, and
Absolutely.
This may appear as a promotion for the Chartered Institute, but it is deliberately, but in a positive way, because some of the questions about are there case studies, are there examples, are there techniques? Well, this is why this group is embedded within the Chartered Institute, because it's learning from other systems is how we're going to make progress in both the pharmaceutical and the wider healthcare sector, because I think we have for far too long been parochial, inward looking, and not learning from other complex systems. So I would strongly urge those who want to find out more to contact us and to see how they can engage our group in the Chartered Institute. I think also I would like to point out the very important white paper published by the Chartered Institute, which is called Learning from Adverse Events. This is a free white paper that can be downloaded, and that also provides some good evidence and opinion for everybody about organizational learning, which is one of the main topics. I think I was also interested in around this concept of simplicity, and certainly we inject complexity, for instance, in the way we have ICH guidelines. They're taken away, they're rewritten time and time again. Just what may appear to be small changes in wording can have very significant changes in operation. This is unfortunate, but we need to go back to, I mean, it's all written there in the ICH guidelines, but also our group is working on the concept of guiding principles. And I think this is a very important concept, and you will be hearing more from our group on guiding principles, because then that gives direction to how to design your system. But Julie, did you want to pick up on some specific questions?
Well, I made a list of some of them. One of them was around how you can discuss with SOP authors about trying to put, maybe it links back to the simplicity thing. So in the sense of how can we engage with SOP authors about writing, let's say, more helpful SOPs. I suppose my first question would be is who's writing the SOP? Because sometimes they're a bit remote from the actual task and maybe they don't have the opportunity. So that's probably the first question to ask. And I've seen it myself where people try to over-explain, sometimes because the training isn't very good, frankly. So that can occur sometimes. But maybe, has anyone got any thoughts about engaging SOP authors with human performance?
In preparation for this, I was going back to one of my books of reference, Sidney Decker's Understanding Human Error. And there's a quote in there related to procedures, and procedure is never going to be fully aligned with actual work. That's a fact. Yeah. And yes, what we want to do is try to reduce that misalignment as much as possible. But it's very difficult. And this area of procedural improvement is a constant one for people such as some of the consulting teams at NSF International. We get asked this question a lot. We get asked how to improve how to help clients improve their SOPs. Essentially, take a look at the SOPs, the procedural system, and look at making some changes. In terms of advice, it's very complicated because people need to know what the guiding principles are around a good SOP. They need to know what good looks like. So that's an important takeaway. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you want to move away from SOPs entirely and think about another way of providing the information to the workplace in a simple fashion that's going to reduce their cognitive load, demand on their need to really not engage in a proactive way, but rather assure that they're able to execute the task at hand. So, what's the right medium? What's the right training around guiding principles? These are really important questions to ask because SOPs is something that's a real challenge for most organizations.
Mm-hmm.
This goes back to the idea that SOPs, clinical trial protocols, and other quality documents reflect work as imagined. It is not work as is, and we need to break the mindset of just saying and being surprised when a person cannot follow what is in essence, a fictional document.
So just moving on to another question, if I may. One of the questions from Joseph Donahue was, sorry if I've sort of written it not quite exactly right, but how do you encourage people, get people to tell you about the near misses? Perhaps reflecting back on some of the topics we were looking at. What's your experience?
Yeah. So this is where I'll touch on a couple of things. One is when we lead investigations, I do lead our teams that perform investigations. When we engage with the operators and the associates directly involved in the work, we help explain to them what our role is, what our purpose is, and we describe ourselves as advocates for them. We are here to help advocate for what will help you be successful. And I think that's really helped open up some doors where people do see us as sort of we're not their manager, we're not their super, we don't control anything around their bonuses and things like that. So we're sort of safe and they can open up and talk to us. And in that, we've got to, just navigate making sure that as we share that information or included in the investigations, we're fair. The other thing that I do want to bring up, because we haven't talked about it yet, is the application of learning teams, which is a practice that we've brought into our organization recently. This was an opportunity that we seized initially with safety, where we were seeing a trend in a particular type of safety event. And the learning team practice, which for reference, if you look up Bob Edwards or Andrea Baker, they've got workshops and a book that will help kind of illustrate what the process is. But it's a really good way to engage kind of a team or a group of operators that might perform an activity to help them say, when you do this activity, what kinds of things help it be successful usually? If it were to go wrong, what kinds of things might have happened to get there? And you're just creating and facilitating more of a safe space. And that's when you hear, people just become more willing to open up and say, yeah, each time we do that, we really have to watch it here because frequently we miss that step or that part goes wrong. So those are just two examples of how we've tried to just increase the transparency in our organization.
Yeah, I would add to that really the importance of the leader to get out into the workspace and talk to people in a way that demonstrates humility. It's really easy to say, hey, we need you to speak up. We need to hear about what's going on. That's entirely different than actually going to where work is happening and asking people from a genuine, authentic way. I think you're asking for a very long change curve if you're going to try to get this information from afar. As soon as a leader becomes, actually, to use, I think the word that Amy used there was advocate. I think when the leaders begin to be seen as advocates when they're in the workplace, they're going to hear more about, those near misses and those opportunities for improvement rather than, oh my God, the leaders in the workplace, let's go find something else to do.
And I think the power of language, as we have said, shouldn't be underestimated. Just the very difference between asking why something happened or how something happened, just that, because the brain just delivers what it hears, it can't help it really. So having learning teams, in my experience, has made a huge difference. Thank you. One question I've got here, sorry, just quickly look there. Do we have any examples or studies to show where lean and hop have been integrated, or anything which someone could use as an example? I have to say, I, off the top of my head, don't have anything. Does anyone know of anything? But we can go away if not, and look.
Yeah, I'm not aware of one. I think, based on my experience and just discussions, with colleagues and, the peers that you see on this panel, it's sort of an area that we recognize where there's synergy, but there's also things that we sort of need to resolve, let's say, between, like Julia brought up, whys, the original Toyota production system talks about when you do cause analysis, ask the 5 whys. Again, I think the intention is that you're digging deeper into what's going on. But from a human and organizational performance perspective, we would say, well, just ask how, not why, and you're going to get very different answers. I'm not aware of a lot of literature either, though hopefully this is something that people are starting to look into.
Yes.
So there are references out there. Yeah.
I know your article shared in LinkedIn, which we'll share on the feedback, which you all wrote together, does talk about that. Mm-hmm. One, in fact, 3 people asked, surely pharmaceutical companies do this process safety. They're using human performance in process safety. So can you just talk a little bit about maybe that sort of difference between the safety approach, let's say, and the quality approach? I'm doing this because they're kind of siloed organizations in a way.
Yeah, and that's where, to your point, Julie, they are somewhat siloed, yes, and depending on the operation, like we have some manufacturing operations that don't fall under process safety requirements, and we have others that do. So it does apply, but yeah, it is regulated by different standards and different guidance. So those get set up from a safety perspective according to that guidance, but it's limited to those areas where it applies. Whereas, the way that we're kind of overseen, let's say, by health authorities, whether it's EMA or FDA or others, it's an entirely different set of standards and guidances that we need to adhere to. So that's kind of how it shows up.
So when we're thinking of the bigger system, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because obviously you and I, when we work, we're not now in safety, now we're in quality, now we're in efficiency. It's like all mixed up. So that's very interesting. I'm just conscious we're coming up a little bit. I think we said we'd run to 6:15 UK time.
I'd just like to point out on the topic of lean that in this area of human performance, we're not promoting one technique over another, or I think part of the rationale is within an organization, people will be in good faith applying different techniques. And what we recommend is find out what your organization is doing and start understanding that, and then explaining principles of human performance, saying we can help you make this work better, and have you thought of this or have you thought of that? So I think it's important not to be disruptive in our approach, saying, oh, we've got the solution here, this is what you should be doing. It doesn't quite, it's much more subtle and nuanced, I think, how you're going to do this. And because we can't say you must be doing this or that. And I think this is certainly what we've learned from our experience of working with other sectors. I would also like to point out our international collaborations. We have Carlos from Relata, the Latin American Human Factors Group, and we're very conscious on the topic of language, communication, simplicity, that you get lost in translation. And particularly in the area of manufacturing, it's important that we understand the point of view from the Japanese, the Chinese, how can we help them? And that's how we help each other. We don't need no time to go there, but we are very conscious of that. So it's just to make sure the audience realize we're not just Anglo-Saxon, Western focused. No, we're thinking global system all the time.
Can I add one more comment on the lean human performance thing? There's a lean pillar, I think, that is probably not given enough voice, and that's respect for people. And so there's so much emphasis put on process efficiency that that pillar tends to be de-emphasized. And so I think when we're looking for the opportunities to build those bridges between these ideas, I think that's really where there's some fertile ground to explore. Because a lot of times it's a battle between the practical, the person who's got the practical experience in applying lean and those who are approaching it from a very dogmatic standpoint. I think those that have a practical focus on it tend to be a a little more receptive to those ideas, particularly when we start bringing up the idea of respect for people.
And I think the COVID situation really shows us the power, the excellence that are our people that do the work. You know, when a lot of the administrative buildings weren't occupied during COVID, and people who were actually making the very important medicines and supporting them were kind of physically left to their own devices, I think there we really understood how our processes work every day. And it's just because it's the people that complete them and how excellent they are. So I think there's a lot, I imagine, coming out of the learning from COVID about how those adaptations can be really brought into the system as opposed to being seen only as deviations.
It would be fair to say that there's been a lot of learning as a result of COVID, a lot of learning across the board. And operationally speaking, organizations that have been on the front of this have had to do amazing things to get product out the door in such a short time frame. And for sure, there was learning in each of these companies in so many different areas that they could be reflecting on and then leveraging going forward. And that's what learning teams is all about, is trying to tease out those things that were done differently. And then how do we consider those and embed those going forward? And if you do go to some of the articles that we've written, your problem is not air, for instance. I think this one illustrates how we can learn from situations and essentially make our operations quite a bit better. So those.
We'll share all the links to those articles also.
That's great, Julie.
Great. So Steve, we're up on time, I think. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for a really interesting webinar. We will look at the questions and we will, sorry, I'm getting some feedback. Let me do it. And we will, sorry, an error. We will be making an attempt to answer the questions also, and we'll include links to articles and that have been referred to. And if anyone wants any more information about the pharma manufacturing subgroup, please contact me. I'm on LinkedIn, and I'll also include my email address for anyone that wants to follow up. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, John, James, and Amy, for your contributions to this. This is only one station, one stop on the journey for human performance, but it's an important stop, and I hope those that have attended today have learned something, and they are very welcome to come and join us on the ever-lengthening train.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, everyone. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, John. Thanks,
well done,
Steve.
Julie, and to our panel, well done. You've navigated us well to time. Thank you for a fascinating session. We look forward to perhaps another in the future, and certainly the recording will be available fairly shortly. So thank you for that. To our audience, if you've enjoyed this session, then there are further sessions coming up in the near future. One in particular on healthcare and the use of artificial intelligence, which I think will appeal to many, coinciding with the launch of a white paper by the Chartered Institute. So that is coming along fairly shortly. And secondly, a masterclass on workplace assessment, which I know there's been a good deal of interest in. So please see our website for further details on those. Please check our website if you're not a member regarding what the Institute does and how it may help you. Finally, then, again, a final thank you to our organising team, particularly to Julie and to Brian. We look forward to seeing you on a future event. The room will stay open for chat for 2 or 3 minutes or so as you all file out, say your final goodbyes. We'll then close ready for our next event. So thank you to you, our audience, for joining and making this a successful event. Until next time, may I invite all speakers to mute their cams and mics, please, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.
Thank you, Steve.
Yes, thank you, Steve, for organising this.
Our pleasure, Brian. Thank you, and thank you, John.
Will we have access
Thank you.
to the
Great.
questions, Steve?
Yes, there will be a recording available, Julie, and we can make a.
The chat questions. I meant really. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. The chat questions are shown in the recording, but they're also available as a separate file, which I'll make
fab.
sure.
I have made some notes, but I couldn't make too many.
No, there's some very good questions, which would be form the basis of any publication.
Could like to try and answer them
Yeah.
if possible. Sorry, John. Did you say something? Apologies.
I was just going to say, yeah, having them as a separate file would be really helpful.
Yeah.
Probably much easier to go through rather than trying to pick them out
Yeah.
from the recording.
So I'll pull the questions together, and then maybe we could have a session. But I haven't negotiated